All right. So tonight we are doing complexity to aestheticism, which is my very fancy way of saying we are now going into the very late part of the Middle Ages and we're moving into the Renaissance, and things are about to get complicated before they get pretty. Now, I will say this. I have taught this class before and have been very surprised by my people that are taking this class as to how they tend to kind of enjoy this kind of music. And this kind of music is a little bit of an acquired taste. So I have high hopes for tonight that this will go well. Next slide, please. So what's happening? We're looking at the years 1225 to 1450. Music reflects the growing complexity of the humanities and becomes an experimental ground for composers eager to push boundaries and stretch the range of the ear. That we could say that about any time frame. Composers are always trying to push the boundaries. Now we push them through technology. If it wasn't for people like Russ, we wouldn't be able to do as much as we do. So, as we are pushing, we're always trying new things, and that's what's happening here. Composers themselves broke free from monasticism. They're no longer working solely inside the cloister. Now they're able to break free, they're able to move around, they are able to become international, and they pick up tons of new flavors when it comes to musical sounds. They establish themselves in the patronage system, which is a system that gives them, at this point, greater freedom. Now, hold on to that thought for a little while, because we're going to come back to that exact thought several weeks down the road where I'm going to bash the patronage system. But for right now, we're happy about it. It's a step in the right direction to create flexibility for our composers. The music within the church flourished for the elites and those who could afford it. So we're really talking about music that is still high end. It's for people who have money, even people within the church who have money. This is not necessarily a development that we are seeing for the masses. We're not really going to see the common folk getting to enjoy this music for quite a while. The choral mass develops, as does the motet, which we will talk about in a little bit too. It's a very important kind of music, and it brings new heights of musical splendor for the worshipers, for the listeners, those who are of the upper crust. Next slide. Why does it even matter to us? It's because here we see, and the way I phrase it is that music is now quantified, numerically categorized, and qualified, honed to be beautiful, honed to be quality, in a sense that it becomes the realm of both this mathematical numerical prowess, and it also develops this beautiful sense of aesthetic pleasingness to the ear, and music starts to sound pretty, and they're focusing it on it sounding pretty. It sounds pretty to us here in our own time too. No longer is it going to sound so medieval, which to many people does sound beautiful. I'm one of them. However, you can distinctly tell when something sounds medieval, and we're going to leave that behind a bit today. The rise of the composer and the patronage system is an established means of sponsoring the arts. And it roots itself firmly in Western history until Beethoven breaks that mold. Now, we are going to see several people who are not in the patronage system throughout this time frame. Beethoven is kind of the big name that is ever always used when people say somebody had to break the mold of having a patron say, here, write this piece of music for me and I will pay you money. And the composer says, oh, yes, absolutely, thank you. Even if it's the church, oh, yes, thank you, I will take your money. That's a great way to make money, but we do eventually need to get out of it. So here we go. Next slide. Complexity. Moving on. So medieval Europe as a complex society. One of the biggest pet peeves that I have is with people who assume that medieval Europe was some kind of backwoods place where people were groveling in mud on the ground and all screaming about burning witches. Yes, I have just quoted Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Um, it wasn't like that at all. Yes, those things did exist to some extent, but then again, if we traveled somewhere in the world today, we could probably find that today too. Instead, what's important to know is that this was an incredibly complicated and complex place that had a very strong understanding of so many different aspects of life that we choose to often look away from. And that includes music. Think about cathedrals. They didn't have power tools, they didn't have calculators, they didn't have computers. And yet, those things are still standing today. They are awe inspiring. The fact that they made those things without a single electric outlet is incredible. That alone should have us draw our attention back to the idea that maybe we are underestimating the medieval mind. Scientific understanding in daily life. These were people that knew how to get yeast for their bread from the air. They knew how to get salt from their table by pouring water into boiling vats. They understood that if they let their butter churn stand out in the sunlight, that UV rays would actually help sanitize them and clean them for them. They didn't know how it worked, but they knew it worked. They had figured it out through trial and error. They made ale. They made alcohol. These are complex processes, and they did it through years of trial and error, and that which allowed them to figure out and hone exact scientific processes needed for the comforts of daily life. Complexities in food and medicine. Medieval food is my side hobby besides medieval history. I love studying the complexities of it. And it is most of our words that we use today, like bake, roast, strain, boil, these are all words that were used in medieval Europe as well. And if you look at books of recipes, like we have The Form of Curry from Richard II, beautiful 15th century book. And we have amazing recipes in there that we could still totally use today and find absolutely delicious. And you could find them in a Michelin star restaurant. We have incredible amounts of advanced skills there. And medicine was tied completely to food. You had food and medicinal practices together. So, with this great complex society that had learned so much about the world around it and used and leaned on natural resources so much, it kind of is a pity that we assume that they were somehow some kind of backwoods people. They really weren't. This is what we must remember. This is a time of intellectual development. This is a time when music is reflecting that development. And much of our understanding of medieval thought, much of that kind of negative vibe that we get actually comes from much later, from other sources of times when people are trying to say that their own time is better. So there's my rant on medieval. It is much more complex than we think it is, and it's much more advanced than we think it is. Next slide. I wanted to show you these wonderful examples here. The first one on the top is Guidelon Castle, which is actually not a medieval castle. That is a castle being built today completely in the medieval style. It's a 25-year project. It's almost done at this point, and you can actually see the complexities of how it is that they made these things. It is taking them 25 solid years to put together a castle in the exact same manner as would have been done in the 13th century. It's a lot of time. Below it, although it's a little bit pixelated, I apologize, we have a lovely picture of art which shows something about art. We tend to think of medieval art as caricaturish and immature, but if you look carefully at the gowns, look at the folds, you can see shading. You can see that there's depth perception. They do understand these things. They're choosing not to use them. Saying that they didn't understand these things in art is the same thing as us looking at a comic book series today and saying that people in the 21st century didn't know how to draw. It's not it. That's a chosen medium that they were using. Let's look at the food. That's actually, we have a brie tart there. That's actually a medieval recipe that you're seeing. And then finally, of course, Notre Dame, a perfect example of incredible advancement. Next slide. Examples of musical complexity. And I'm hoping that my oh, there it is. There comes my video. So here's what we're going to be looking at in this example of musical complexity, which is a perfect example of this time frame. Polyphonic, multi-sound, multi-voices singing at the same time. Polyrhythmic, different rhythmic structures happening at the same time. Polytextuality, multiple texts happening at the same time. Polylinguistic, two languages being done at the same time. We wouldn't dare to do something like this today, but they did dare to do it back then. Let's give it a listen. You heard intervals that we wouldn't normally choose to use today. There was a very obvious tritone in there. That's a wonderful pitch that our ears don't like. In fact, it's the tone used for train whistles because it cuts through faster than anything else in our ears. We don't like tritones, and there's a tritone used in there. There is lack of rhythmic organization. It's to our ears anyway. To theirs, it was definitely there. This is a high art. This is Fashion Week in Paris. This is very, very much something that the elite would be able to understand. And a sense of academic elitism is definitely flourishing to create a piece of music like this. They have to add in all the things. Next slide. Do all the things. Because, we can't just have a little bit. We must do it all, which is a fault of medieval cooking as well. Unfortunately, they're really big on way too many spices. It took a long time for the French to realize that simplicity was the best way for cooking. Back then, they just, chose to put as many spices together as they possibly could because spices were expensive. But we've learned, as they did, that sometimes simple is better. Next slide. This is a lovely pile for us, breaking down the whole thing. And I'm going to break down as much of this as I possibly can without making it too complex. There are 3 time frames that we are looking at right now. Ars Antiqua, which is 1183 to 1315. Ars Nova, 1315 to 1377. And Ars Subtilior, which is 1365 to 1440. Here's what we need to know. The Ars Antiqua is what we talked about last week. This is the time when you are looking at Notre Dame polyphony, those early composers writing music with multiple lines together. Here's what we also need to know about it. If you're an art major, I'm really sorry, this is the Ars Nova. Our Ars Nova in music is actually later. So if you're an art major and a music major, you're going to get really confused because there's 2 different times called the Ars Nova. By the way, Ars not meaning art, but meaning technique. Antiqua, old technique. Ars Nova, new technique. So we're talking about the Ars Nova. What's happening in the Ars Nova? We get sacred and secular polyphonic pieces for specified and non-specified uses. Okay, so what's happening? We get pieces that were written for the church and pieces that were written for the church and also have secular stuff in them. And these pieces have sometimes very specific uses. They're a Kyrie, they're a Gloria, they're an Agnus Dei, they're part of the Mass. Or they're a Conductus or a Motet, and they just got stuck wherever they had some spare space. And it can kind of just go from there. They break from the rhythmic modes and they start to offer greater rhythmic independence. We talked about the rhythmic modes last time. The rhythmic modes were a wonderful way of calculating how rhythm could be written down. We remember talking about the fact that in the Ars Antiqua during Notre Dame polyphony, we just finally learned, after all those thousands of years, how to write down rhythm. And they did it by writing them down in little tiny codes called rhythmic modes. And one artist named Johannes de Garlandia gave us all the details we needed about that. He talked about the way they were written down. Well, in Ars Nova, they break that. They start writing them any way they want. And what happens when you put a kid in a candy store? They grab everything. Well, that's what happened to the composers. They were kids in candy stores. And that's why the music rhythms sound kind of crazy, because they're just eating all the candy. Now, we also need to discuss the fact that in Ars Antiqua, it was musica modesta, or modest music. By the time you get down to the Ars Nova, all of the critics are out there making a lot of complaints about the fact that this music is too crazy, it's too out there, it's just not good enough for God anymore, because it's out to show off for itself and not out to be beautiful for God. That's a legitimate complaint, and it will come back again later, many, many times throughout history. Can you have music that's complicated and also have it be something that is worshipful and glorifies God as it should? Those are big questions. I noted something called isorhythm. I'm going to be honest right now. I would like to avoid getting too deep into the science of music in this class. Isorhythm is something that kind of digs into that a little bit. Just know that there's this thing out there called isorhythm that a lot of these songs tend to use, and maybe someday we can talk about it further. But for right now, it's a lot of detail we don't need. And also for Ars Nova, it's coming to us from northern France, from Burgundy. Now, right afterwards comes this little tiny period, the subtle technique from 1365 to 1440. This is coming to us from southern France, and they are the ultimate in high art. They like music that has a lot of crazy rhythms, but also has things like eye music, music written into shapes, like actually writing the music lines into shapes of hearts and into shapes of harps, hearts, all sorts of things, so that only the musicians can even see the art. So it's really elitist. It's only for the people who not only can pay for it, but could play it too. So with that being said, this is not a big art form, but it's there and we should be discussing it. Let's give an idea of what this all sounded like. And here's right flat down the middle. Go ahead. Myself. That is actually my example that I was using for the beginning of this. This is the Ars Antiqua moving into the Ars Nova, that particular thing you just heard. So before all the complexities and the weirdness happened, that's what it sounded like. Now, let's take a look and see what happened once the composers really started to play with it. With this next recording, I'm going to explain it really quickly. Here's what you're listening to. You're listening to 3 different lines of music. The upper 2 lines are going to do most of the work. But what they've done in the recording is they're playing it one time with people singing it and one time with instruments playing it. Because back then, they didn't specify if an instrument were to play, they didn't specify the instrument was going to play. They just assumed it would pick up one of the lines that was written for voice. So it could have been done either way. Any piece that can be done for voices can be done for instruments too. And the other thing to note, this piece, it was written to get twice as fast halfway through. Here we go. Oh, that one.
Qui transforme colonne réponse là de cette
Slight technical difficulty, but it's okay. You'll have a copy of this recording too. Let's give it another try. While we're trying, it is a secular text, but it best shows what's happening. Yeah, I see it. We are pausing it so that it has a moment to kind of catch up to itself a little bit. I don't know about you, but the internet was very slow today when I was teaching. Crashed on me several times. Maybe it's just a bad day for the internet.
Le salut qui te ressemble colonneux en se répensant là de cette
Oop. And it's giving us another circle. Well, let's do this. Let's come back to it because you do have the copy of the recording as well. We'll come back to this lovely example, but just that we know what happens in it. What ends up happening is those rhythmic complexities that you heard, because it didn't quite feel like there was ever really a sense that the rhythm was landing. When you put that at twice its speed, it gets really complicated. And that's what they loved back then. They loved seeing that incredible complexity. Now that they knew how to make this work and the ideas had been popped into their heads about rhythmic notation, all of a sudden the world was open to them. Think of it very much like the way we all felt the first time we could access internet on our phones. Suddenly, the world changed, and it's been moving at a breakneck speed ever since. And that's exactly what happened to them here. Suddenly, they had a new thing in mind, and off they went. Yeah, let's give it a bit more to go if we can. Well, we got a bit more of it. Now I can hear what it sounds like with instruments, and we haven't really had that experience yet. We will talk more about instruments in the next class period, but for right now, we're still primarily in vocal land. Let's go ahead and move on for right now and see if we can come back to it. How did we get to this point? With all this craziness, all these crazy rhythms, what happened? What brought us here? And next slide. Explanation, status, it's complicated. So crucial elements from this time frame. Here's what we need to know. We need to know that first off, people did continue chant on its simplistic level. The chant that we've known the whole time, that doesn't go away. It's just that when you have a lot more money, which people of the upper crust in society and upper members of the church tend to have, you tend to want something a bit more fancy and a bit more polished. And once the composers are able to escape from the idea of just sticking themselves in a monastery and can be out in the community and have a patron of some kind, suddenly they can push it exactly as far as their royal or their church patrons want them to do so. Here are the things that we need to hear about. There's so many of them. Conductus, clausulae, gimel, expansion of intervals, clearly defined purposes, fixed chant as a bass, cantus, creative expansions above the bass, motet, all of these big fancy words that all amount to the same thing. We're growing. Music is growing and it's growing fast. This is that awkward, gawky growth period. So, pimples on the face of a teenager. Here we go. While we are going through all of these crazy transitions, it's important to note that the regular, everyday, common person is still going to mass just like they always have. But back then, frequently, they're not actually doing as much as you might do when you're in mass today. Number one, they're not going to be doing very much of the chanting. The monks do that for them. Number two, they rarely participate in communion. Here's why. Because honestly, it was a major issue with disease, with hygiene. They didn't necessarily want a bunch of very, very dirty, potentially sick peasants coming towards the altar, towards where the priest was standing. The reason why sometimes they had things like screens up to protect them from the sacred rites. So, what we are looking at is a culture of people who are used to seeing people do everything for them, which is why it's the celebrant of the Mass, the person who is actually doing the Mass himself and also partaking in the Mass. The reason why they hold the communion wafer up so that all can see it, because even seeing it still allows you to reap the benefits from it. So, with that being said, we are seeing that people that are going to church, people who are attending Mass and are not of the wealthy levels, are going to hear chant like they've always heard it and are going to experience the Mass the way they've always experienced it. They're not necessarily going to be getting the benefits of all of this. This is for the rich, the 1%. Next slide. Conductus. I want to talk about two major things that have definitely made huge contributions to this time. Without them, we wouldn't have the music today that we know and love. The first is conductus. A conductus is simply a piece of music that is written without an existing chant line. It's completely freeform. It's new. You totally wrote this melody out from your head, or in reality, you picked it up from something you heard somewhere, which means that secular melodies made their way into sacred music. Then you would write new Latin sacred text on it, kind of like a hymn. Then, once you had your main melody line, you would write a duplum or a descant line above it. And you'd make sure the two of them matched. After that, you could write the triplum, another line above that, and make sure that those all matched. You didn't really write it the way we would write music today, where we would write music down this way, I'd write a chord, and then I'd write a chord, and then I'd write a chord. Nope, you'd write one line, then you'd write another line, and then you write your third line to make sure they all match together. And once you had all of that, you would be looking at something that is not that crazy, not that complex. In fact, you're not even going to have that many words on the lowest lines. But at the same time, you're going to have a piece of music that's truly brand new. Why is this here? It's a filler piece. It's for when the priest needed a little extra time because he was taking a while to walk. It's when some part of the Mass was taking a bit more time than they expected. This is filler music. Let's take a listen to some filler. Thank you. And next slide. The next thing we're going to talk about is the motet. And the motet is the game changer. It's actually the granddaughter of the conductus. The conductus came from something called the clausulae, and so did the motet. The clausulae is the clausulae inspired the conductus, but it was truly related to the motet. Here's what it is. Clausulae is part of those old Notre Dame polyphony pieces I showed you last time. If they had to expand something, because again, they needed to expand it, priest was taking a little bit too long doing the walk, then what you could do is you can insert a clausulae. It's a little tiny bit of music that can get just dropped into the middle of any piece of music, kind of like if you've got a Barbie doll with an interchangeable jacket. It just gets plopped in there and it matches with everything. And after a while, those clausula started to stand on their own. And then they started to form their own pieces of music on their own and became something called the motet. So the motet, mot meaning word. Motets are very popular in the 14th and the 15th century. And here's how you build one. This is your recipe. Number one, you pick a previously existing, we're having technological situations tonight. You pick a previously existing chant. That's number one. So something that had already been written, and we've from any one of the chants we've talked about in the past. Pick your chant. Okay. Number two, you're going to add extra voices to it. so that it's more complex. And you're going to use rhythmic complexity in those extra voices, but you're not going to use it so much in the chant. You're kind of leave it alone. It gets to just sit there being nice and plain and boring while everything is moving crazy up and above. Then you are going to mix in multiple texts. This is optional. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can just keep it nice and sacred and straightforward if you want to. But if you really want to mess with things, then you can mix in multiple texts with multiple different languages. And if you really want to mess with things, you can mix the sacred and the secular. This is where we get love songs that are on top of sacred chants. They do exist out there. Combination of sacred, secular, multiple languages at the same time. And also at the same time, you have the rhythmic complexity, and then you have the different voices. It's a whole mess. What I've chosen to give you as my example today, though, is a lovely 3-voice motet that sticks with one sacred text. What am I going to do with the motet? Why do I even bother writing it? Am I going to sell it to somebody? No. It's going to be used in the church, and it's going to be used again as filler music. It's going to go wherever we can drop a little bit of extra space or time, just like the Conductus did. But the big difference is this isn't going to try and go as rhythmically crazy. It's going to play around, but not go as nuts. And the other thing is, it's not newly composed. The chant line is still some old chant that's been around forever. Let's give it a listen. So why bother? Why bother worrying about this? What does this little piece, what does this motet mean to us? Motet becomes the composer's playground for the next several hundred years. And while they're playing in the motet, they also create a lot of the musical rules that we still use today. Along with that, they create the structure that has become many different forms of music since then. And by the way, we still have motets being performed and composed today. It's still a form. It's one of the strangest forms there is because we still don't really have a solid definition for it. Now we just say it's a piece of music for more than one part, or maybe for one part, but we're not quite sure. And that's literally all we can say about it. It's kind of your catch-all. It's anything that is, if it's not something else, it's a motet. Let's move on to the next slide. While all this is happening, there's always Spanish music too. I love this recording because this recording allows us to hear what it could have sounded like with a bit of percussion. We know percussion was used. We know stringed instruments were used. We know woodwind instruments were used. And this gives us a chance to feel it a bit better. The cantigas are beautiful songs that tell us mostly about the stories of pilgrims that were going to Santiago de Compostela, which was the biggest pilgrimage route in Europe at the time. If you weren't going on crusade, you were going to Santiago, or you were heading to see Thomas Becket after Thomas Becket met his sad end. So with this one, you're going to go to Spain. You're going to take the El Camino to Santiago de Compostela, and who knows what might happen to you on that route. In this song, some pilgrims take a big piece of roast beef with them and they're going to eat it later. And some bandits come and steal it. And so they pray to the Virgin Mary to please show them where the meat is because they're hungry. And the Virgin Mary makes a miracle happen and the beef starts jumping up and down so high that they can see where it is. And they go and they knock out those bad bandits and they get their meat back. That's what the story is behind this song. Let's give it a listen. I would recommend strongly if you have the opportunity to listen to that one all the way through because they tell the whole story of the beef. And even if you don't understand the language, he sings it in a wonderful bard like way, which really kind of just draws you in. And at a certain point, he's telling the story and it's very magical and it's really fun. So, even sacred music can find its way into having fun parts of life. It may be that this is actually something that they would have heard more in the folk regions of Europe. We would have heard that more in secular forms. We don't really quite know what music would have sounded like for them, but we have lots of really good guesses. And this is one that is probably pretty close. I've actually had this used in several of my medieval musicology classes. I'm getting the feeling that this is probably quite authentic. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. The choral mass. If you've ever been at a mass for an Easter service or a Christmas service, you've probably heard pieces of a choral mass. So let's figure out what it is and why it's here. It's developed as high art. Again, we're going back to that whole idea of we're walking a runway fashion in week in Paris, which means the weird stuff's going to come out, but also the cool stuff. 14th century Europe. Okay, so for this one, here's what we need to know. It's one singer on a part at first, but after a while, they go ahead and start adding extra singers, not girls. So when we hear these recordings with women singing, that's incorrect. We're still looking at an all male group at this point. So it should technically be either boys or male singing in a soprano range on the top. But we'll go ahead and listen to some recordings with some girls as well. Ordinary only, not the proper. So your five big ones: Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Agnus Dei. It's going to be one of those. The Kyrie is often still chanted, especially in England. Now, I have to admit, I don't quite know why, and I'll have to do some more digging into that. But the Kyrie does come up as a chant a lot. Now, I don't know, again, I'm not really quite sure why they chose not to also embellish that. I find it interesting that the only one that gets kept as a chant a lot is the only one that's actually in Greek. Kyrie eleison is Greek, not Latin. Fragments such as the Tournai Mass of the early 14th century do exist, but the earliest complete Mass is the Machaut, who is named after Guillaume de Machaut, who is a composer and the one that has composed a lot of the music that we've listened to tonight. He wrote his mass in the mid 14th century. Yes, you read that right, the mid 14th century. What was happening during the mid 14th century? Well, it definitely made COVID look like it was not it was not as big as we know it to be today, and that is the Black Death. 1349 was the Black Death. And yet in the middle of all this, he wrote that. He did survive it. He lived until 1377 and did not die of the plague. This developed quickly, this idea of the choral mass. From the time of the Black Death to the end of the Renaissance, several forms of mass were actually developed for the choir. That's cyclic mass and canonic mass and all sorts of different kinds of mass and masses using different types of songs that were also carols that were also used in secular settings. And oh my goodness, it never ends. All these different kinds of composed masses. And after a while, they create this amazing repertoire that we have of Renaissance Catholic music. We'll go more into that next week. But for this week, let's look ahead to the next slide. We're going to check out first the Tournai. The Tournai Mass is named for the location, and we don't have the whole thing. So it doesn't get counted as the first complete mass, but it lets us know what choral mass would have sounded like at the beginning of the 1300s. Let's give a listen, if the internet wants us to.
Gloria in excelsis Deo.
We're pausing. And while we pause, just that we know, what you just heard is actually called an incipit. It's when we sing part of our choral mass piece, whether it be a Kyrie or a Gloria or anything else, we sing a little part of it with the original chant. And then we go into the choral piece. It's just part of this tradition. So you'll hear it a lot when you're listening to one of these pieces and wonder, why is it that one little solo at the beginning? That's the incipit. Thank you. And if you're familiar at all with the Latin versions of the Gloria, you may actually recognize the words. Now, that's what it sounded like in the beginning of the 1300s. It still had a lot of that weird little rhythmic tripping thing that they're doing back then. And some of the intervals, some of the notes, the way they match up to each other, don't quite sound like we would expect them to. They still have that medieval sound to it. So let's skip ahead to Machos. Machos was written in the middle of the 1300s. Let's see how much change we made in about 30 years.
Glory.
Push back. There we go. Let's try it again. While it's thinking, you're going to hear the incipit on this one as well. And it's a different Gloria. Oh, circle of death. It's still showing that it doesn't want to go yet. So again, you do have these recordings. Oh, we've got a little bit. Let's give it a try.
Gloria in excelsis Deo.
That was et inter for et in terra pax. And listening to the two and comparing them, both of them have some very interesting choices when it comes to which pitches they pick. But at the same time, the second one clearly has a much less vibrant rhythmic style. And that's going to be a big player as we move forward. The trouble is when you start adding in 4 voices, 5 voices, 6 voices, having those crazy rhythmic lines just doesn't work as well anymore. That's kind of thing that you can only use when you have something with fewer voices in it. So because of that, people start to shy away from that style and they move on. And that's actually really good, not only for the text, but for the way the music sounds to us as well. Next slide. All right, now we have 2 different choices now. I can go ahead and attempt this, or I can talk for a moment. I think I'm going to talk for a moment and give it some time to warm up a bit. International preferences. Over the next little tiny bit of this lecture, we're going to talk about the most important influential part during this time frame, and that is the English sound. You heard me right, English. We normally don't think of English as a major influencer on the continent of Europe. However, in this case, England was what saved music history. England was starting to get very interested in a sound that involved a lot of major thirds and major sixths. Or to say that in plain men's terms, that's a sound that's very sweet and pleasant to the ear, even now. And it was because of their tuning system that they were allowed to play with those a bit more than other people chose to do so. So they liked things that had a prettier sound to them. They also liked something called first inversion chords. They didn't call it that. We call it that today. What that just meant is that they liked their music stacked in a certain order that has a bit of a nostalgic sound to it. So this is what Dunstable, an English composer, was doing at the same time as the later parts of Machot. And let's see what his music sounds like. Thank you. As you can hear, he's still using some rhythmic complexity, but he's using it with the purpose. He also likes some sounds that today our ear just goes, ah, that sounds right. That's the sound I've been missing for these last 3 lectures. That's the sound I was looking for. So let's play around more with that sound. Let's move on to the next one, the superstar, composer, and aesthetic beauty. Let's go on. Tons of words on one page. This was because I had a lot to say. So we're moving away from complexity. Yay. And we're moving towards aesthetics, an aesthetic sound instead. We're not so much focused on trying to show that we can do something amazing. Instead, we're just doing it with simplicity. I suppose we can go back to that old analogy that I had earlier about too much spice in the food before. And yet now French cooking, which is so famous, is also so very simplistic in its way of being brought around. And that's exactly what's happening here too. They took away some of all that complexity and they brought instead a simplistic beauty to music that they carried throughout the Renaissance. Fabredon comes to us from Burgundy, and it's an imitation of the style that was developed in England that I just mentioned, called the English Gammel. Now, this style allows you to, again, have your chords stacked in a really weird way, and then also to use these intervals, major thirds and sixths, to create a very sweet, pleasant sound, actually called the sweet English sound. Composers becoming more international allows them to travel and to learn these different styles. And because of that, they can start incorporating it and then moving it to other places in Europe, which means other people get to hear it too. What does this have to do with the church? Well, the church was one of the main people that was hiring composers to go from place to place and to make new music for them. The church was the biggest benefactor, remembering, of course, that throughout medieval Europe, the church and the aristocracy are two twin spheres of power. They're constantly battling at each other, and throughout this entire time, we see them fighting each other, even for the greatest composers. And that allows us to have some amazing music as the competition and the money get raised higher and higher. So, as continental Europe, France especially, chooses to stick for a little while longer with the sound that we already heard, like Philip de Vitry, a very important composer of the time, they like that sound, which we call now very medieval, parallel fourths, if you know music, moving parallel fourths, moving parallel fifths, and cadential points, or kind of like sentence period points that don't quite end the way we expect them to in the music. And when you put all that together, that gives us that sound that just kind of makes us a little bit eerie out. We're like, oh, I don't know. That's the medieval sound that we're all so used to hearing. Now, we've kind of punched through that here. And we have several composers that are doing it. Machot starts doing it. Then Benchois does it. And Dufay does it. And they start to incorporate these sounds from the English. And that allows us to break through into the Renaissance. Let's go to the next slide. Guillaume Dufay is the composer I chose to stick with for my superstar composer. There are so many I could have chosen, and poor Guillaume de Machaut is currently rolling over in his grave and very mad at me for not having him be the one, because I used a ton of his pieces in this lecture already. But let's talk about Dufay. 1397 to 1474, he's a Franco-Flemish composer. He's from the Burgundian school. He's an international traveler, and he is the one that I think primarily pushes us into the Renaissance. Let's do the next slide. Santa Maria del Fiore, you may know it as the Duomo, is the place where he became the legend that he is. This is another story about a famous church and architecture which changes music. The dome itself was in trouble. You see, it hadn't been constructed yet at this time. And here's the problem. Nobody had ever made a dome that large since the Pantheon was made in ancient Rome. So there the building stood with no dome on top of it and all of the rain going down into the church. And they had no idea what they were going to do. And they finally decided to hire somebody who had no real architectural experience whatsoever. In fact, he'd placed second in a bronze cutting contest for a set of doors. They trusted him because they loved his idea the best. His name was Brunelleschi. Let's go on to the next slide. Brunelleschi. This was his impossible dome. He created it in 1436, and he changed history. It's still the largest brick mason dome in the entire world. And He built it by imagining what a hard-boiled egg or a roasted egg would look like if you smooshed down the top. As it smooshed down the bottom and had it just stand on its head. The way it looks, that's how he did his dome. He said it was just an inspirational idea. And then instead of worrying about bricks that were going to fall in, he arranged them in what's called a herringbone pattern. So they kind of support themselves like bookends throughout the entire dome. It took forever for it to get built. But once it was finally constructed, it was the largest dome of its kind, and it inspired Michelangelo and everyone else later that followed in its footsteps. That's what it looks like from the inside. Such a building, such an accomplishment deserved a piece of music never to be forgotten. So let's move on to that next slide. Nuborizar Flores. It's got a lot of complicated things that it is. Let's say for this, first off, that it uses several different time signatures called mensuration. They had different names back then, but it behaves like a time signature. It was designed for the christening of the completed building, which was so impressive that the Pope himself visited and brought a gold rose to celebrate. The music itself bases its time signature measurements off of the biblical description for the measurements of Solomon's temple. So they're really, really sticking with something that's going to be very special. Basically, what Dufay is doing when he's writing this piece of music is he's saying inside the music that this building is as special as Solomon's temple was. Let's take a listen. To give us a little bit more time to listen to that one. It's interesting because you can tell in the very beginning that there is one pitch that has still a very medieval and old sound to it. And I could definitely tell here from my perspective, because I watched Russ just kind of give it a little bit of a head twitch when we got to that pitch. And it was kind of interesting because yes, indeed, there's one pitch that doesn't quite sound right to our ears, but the rest of it definitely does. We've crossed over. We're in the Renaissance now. This is the kind of music that we hear when we listen to early music. He is a very early version of that, but he's definitely there. And so we're going to have him be the one that kind of leaves us until the end of the Renaissance. Here's where we've gone. We've gone from crazy levels of rhythmic complexity because we knew how to do it. We were kids in candy stores going nuts over all these different ideas. We realized at a certain point that complexity like that probably is a little bit overkill. We scaled it back, used English influences, and we created a new beautiful sound. And we're going to use that on the choral mass, the kind of music we were talking about earlier. So next time, let's give me the next slide. We follow the choral mass through the Renaissance, and it's going to pick up some complexity, but it's also going to give birth to new forms. It's going to push compositions to new levels. Beware, instruments are coming. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions?
Were all of the singers still all men?
Yes, unless we had monastic settings like abbeys where we had women that were singing, females that were singing, then yes, we, oh no, I'm sorry, composers. I heard singers and suddenly I realized you said composers. Primarily, I have not found very many female composers throughout this time frame. There are a few small individual cases. We will pick up a bit more next class period, especially once we get towards the Baroque. Interestingly enough, we don't see many female composers on the sacred side. Barbara Strozzi is going to be one of our first big landmarks, and she's anything but sacred.
Mm, mm.
Yes, it's a bit of a disappointment. As somebody who is very interested in female composers, I must admit that I don't personally believe that it's not happening. I believe it wasn't published and so it was lost.
Well, back then, during that time period, I mean, men were dominant.
Yes.
Women really were not.
Absolutely. But we're still going to find, we think of all of those women, especially all those wealthy women living in aristocracy who are learning instruments so that they can catch a husband like a lute. I can't imagine that they're not writing some of their own stuff. I assume somewhat that they are. It's just that it wasn't seen as fit to be published. That being said, we do start to see more of it. But even in the 19th century, when we look at people like Fanny Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann, we see two women who kind of had to put aside their composition careers, either for the sake of their sibling Felix or in the sake of their family. In the case of Clara. So we really don't tend to see a lot of major female composers composing specifically for their sake until the early 20th century with people like Lily Boulanger. Then we finally start to see some real action from female composers. But even today, we're not as represented as we could be.
Yeah, there's, yes.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to tell you about my cousin Muneen.
Yes.
She was a professor of music at the Central Michigan University.
Oh, she's at CMU. Oh, cool. I will look into her then. I'm sure I must have some people that I know with her.
Organist, and I mean, she was she composed music too for, I know there was a flute and I forgot what else it was. But it's music that is really way above my head.
But that explains your interest in the female composers.
Yeah.
It's always been an interest of mine as well, because if we think about it, one of the first composer really whose name we have with an extensive repertoire list is Hildegard von Bingen, is a female. And to be honest, although I didn't really mention it in my lecture last week, Abelard's wife, Eloise, also supposedly was a composer as well. And it's a possibility that some of the pieces we assume are his were actually hers. So it could be that we have stuff from earlier back. We just don't have any absolute proof.
Right, yeah. Well, this has been very enlightening.
Thank you.
I've got a
If
lot of
any
notes.
questions. There's a pile on this one. There was a lot of writing on this one. Now, what I can do, we can always say I can put the slides into PDFs and send them to you as well, so you can have them in PDF form. That way, you can look at the slides and you can look through all those notes, because there were some chunky pages.
Yeah, I wrote what I could.
Yeah, and I'm also a fast talker, as all of my students know. So I'm aware of that as well.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And any questions, let me know.
Nope, I think I'm all done. And thank you very much. And see you next week.
Thank you. See you next week. Bye.
If you want to see any of the other lessons that we have, click up here and you will get a chance to see the other lessons in this series. Have fun. Bye.